Well, good afternoon. My name is Michelle Galloway. I am an alum from the class of '89. Stop and think for a moment. I have the privilege of also being a lecturer here at the law school. I'm also was a former partner at Cooley. I'm now of counsel, or as I like to say, I work for who I want when I want, which is the best possible job one could have. So I was really delighted to be asked to come today and talk about one of the subjects that I am particularly interested in, which is implicit bias. So just as a general rule, I'm really fascinated by how little we know about how the brain works. And if you read the literature every day, there are these great breakthroughs, and still we've only tapped about 10% of what we could possibly raise to our consciousness in our brain. And so I'm going to talk about that 90% that's kind of mysterious, and really how do we address that in the workplace. And I also want to say, you should feel free to ask me questions as we go along. Don't wait till the end. Don't hesitate to say, I think that is complete baloney. I can't believe you said that. Go ahead and call BS on me immediately, because certainly my 8th graders would if that's what I was teaching earlier this morning. So one of the ways that I became interested in this was I found that most of the time when people talked about diversity, what they talked about was, do people look different than me? And that's just actually not that interesting because almost everybody in this room looks substantially different than I do. That doesn't really give me a measure of anything. So I became kind of interested in, not only did I not think it was particularly interesting that people looked different than I did, but really what made it more interesting was how do they think differently? What life experiences and perspectives do they bring to a problem that I don't share? And can I actually think about that and learn from it? And if you want to think about it in a different way, there are some studies that talk about what's the impact on teams when you value diversity. And we could have a whole nother discussion just on this aspect alone. What all the research says is that diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams, this is the catch, if and only if the diversity is valued. If nobody actually tries to be inclusive or to value that diversity in some way, it performs no better than a homogeneous team. But one of the things I thought about this that was kind of interesting is you've got the diverse workforce on this margin, inclusive workforce on this axis. And what it shows is the more diverse and the more inclusive, you get almost a 50% increase and how effective the outcomes that team are. I mean, there's really compelling empirical evidence across a number of studies that says that inclusiveness in the diverse team is the part that makes the difference. So one of the things when I think about women in law is if you were an outsider looking in, so think about members of your family who are non-lawyers, if you were just on the outside looking in, really would you think that women are underrepresented in law? Because you look at the Supreme Court and you'd see there, a third of the justices are women. You might think about looking back over the past weeks and thinking about, who are women who've headed the DOJ. So Janet Reno, Loretta Lynch, Sally Yates, so a number of women. The past president and the current president of the ABA are both women. So you kind of if that's your picture, women are doing fine. What's the issue? Of course, what we know who are in the pipeline is it's 50% of law students, and that's actually been true since I was here in 1989, that we were half of the student body. But only 30% of the profession once you're out a while, 20% of partners and general counsel, only 17% of equity partners. And so I think that's one of the disconnects between what the public sees, which are a number of women in very high-profile positions, contrasted to what we know about the fall off of women out of the profession over time. And really, this is like the iceberg, right? That what took the Titanic down wasn't the 10% that was above the line, it was the 90% under the line that takes out the whole of the ship and takes you down. And so that's how I usually conceptualize it. The explicit, it when you see it kind of bias, that's above the waterline. You can recognize it. The problem for women now is that a lot of that has been pushed below the line. And although many of my comments today are focused on women, fill in the blank, right? Anything other, you could fill in any other group of people and make that same argument. So you might just think about the recent cases that have involved women who are now challenging firms, especially on pay equity and assignment equity. So this was yesterday's headline out of Law 360. There's a suit that's been pending against Sedgwick. Reports say it's near settlement. There was the case against Chadbourne, and there's the newly filed case this week against Proskauer Rose. So there's a number of high-profile cases, largely being brought by women who are, in fact, equity partners, saying, I'm not getting, my share based on my contributions to the firm. What I'm going to focus on today is what a lot of people call second-generation bias. It's not that part that we could look at and measure and recognize. It's what's happening below the surface, people's assumptions that may actually be undermining you. That also means also looking at our own behavior and saying, are there things that I do that also are undercutting how I'm perceived in the profession? So what I'm going to talk about is whether we think we behave rationally, the neuroscience and implicit bias, a little bit about the implicit association test as a measure of implicit bias, and then really try to focus on what can we do about our own implicit bias, and more importantly, what do we do when we think that that's what's in front of us that may be causing decisions to be made about our assignments, about the work we're getting, that we might need to address as we go forward in our careers. How many of you think you are rational? Right. How many of you are convinced that your partner or spouse is completely irrational? Right? This is how you always know the answer to that question. I love this book called Predictably Irrational, and it basically says people are irrational. We like to think, especially as lawyers, right, our go-to strength is our rational analysis and persuasion. And yet, are we really? What's that 90% of our brain doing that we're not even aware of? And so I just picked an example. These are organ donations in Europe. So these are all countries, very, very close proximity. And you can see that in Denmark, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Germany, very few organ donors. But in countries right next to them, Austria, Belgium, France, Hungary, Poland, Portugal, Sweden, almost 100% of people are organ donors. Well, rationally, that shouldn't be, should it? You kind of expect the answer to be the same. What's the difference? What accounts for that difference? Opt-in versus opt-out, right? It's the way you phrase the question plays on people's decision-making biases. Do I have to check a box to become the organ donor, or do I not have to, right? And that accounts for 80% swings in whether people are organ donors or not. Has nothing to do with their value about is this important, and everything to do with a way the question was phrased to play on their decision-making biases. So any of you who've watched infomercials, had things marketed to you, you know people are doing this to you all the time. You know what the biggest one is? Has anybody noticed now on Amazon when they have that little thing that says only 2 left at this price, or the airplane tickets? That's playing on decision-making biases that you have to get you to action, right? So there's also another book called Sway, which I also like, that talks about how we turn a blind eye to information because the primary motivator of much human behavior that we are completely unaware of is a profound aversion to loss. Fear is one of the primary drivers of human behavior, and that's a lot of what we're going to talk about with implicit bias. So I always thought this was interesting. People imbue value based on the context of the situation. So if they go to a music hall and they listen to Joshua Bell, they're like, I paid a lot of money for this ticket. I'm with a lot of other really nicely dressed people. This must be an awesome concert. But when we put Joshua Bell into a baseball cap and we stick him in a subway station and we have him play, what happens? People assign no value to it because the context has been stripped away. And so again, there's a lot of research that we take in all the stimuli and we filter it through what we think we know, often leading to not rational conclusions. So let's talk about that perception as reality. We're going to take a pop quiz. No grades. You have to pass because all you have to do is yell out what you see when you see it, okay? Everybody understand that basic rule? Yell out what you see when you see it. Go. Face. Tip your head to the right. I just like doing this to make you all do what I say. Does everybody see the word liar? And tip your head a little bit the other way, and you should see the face. All right? Everybody understand how the game is played? Here we go. Yeah. Face, saxophone player, and usually the third answer is someone picking their nose. Lots of people say that's what they see. I don't know. I'm just saying that's what it is. Last one. Okay, so some of you see an old lady and some see a young lady. If you want to see the old lady, sort of tip your head to the left. And this is a bump on her nose. This is her nose. This is her eye. This is her mouth and her chin. Everybody see the old lady? Eye, nose, mouth, chin. Young lady kind of looks straight up. The young lady, this is her ear. This is her nose. This is her chin. I don't know what that is, a weird necklace or hash mark on her. I don't know. Everybody with me on that one? Let me see if I have one more. Anybody see evil? Sorry about that. Yeah. Now, what we can tell you is we have absolutely no idea why some of you saw one thing and not the other, right? That's what I want you to really own, is that we don't understand but a very small amount about how the brain is working. I mean, really, are some of you biased against saxophone players? You know, why did only one person call out that they saw the sax player? What did sax players ever do to you, right? We don't know why some of you saw the face before you saw the sax player. And they've done this across any number of different tests. This is one of my favorites. What's this one? How many people see the bunny? What did bunnies ever do to you that you only see the duck? I mean, I really don't think you're biased against bunnies. I just can't explain to you why some of you see one and some see the other. So we're going to do the research that set the basis for implicit bias. So trying to figure out why our brains identify some things in certain ways. So it's called the Stroop test, and what I want you to do is ignore the words or the letters, and I just want you to say the colors as fast as you can. Everybody with me? We're going to say the colors. You guys are a little slow. It's after lunch. You're a little sleepy. Okay, let's try it again. Ignore the word. Say the color. Whoa. Whoa. A little carried away there, Michelle. Okay, let's go. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy, right? All right, try this one. What happened to you? What just happened to you? What happened? Well, one is, yeah, with the lights on, it's harder to see. I didn't realize that till we started. But what happened? Why did you slow down so much? Yeah. Two parts of your brain. One part is seeing the word, and one part is seeing the color, and you're having to bring those together to my instruction that said, say the color, okay? And that's what we use as a proxy for implicit bias in what's called the implicit association test. What they said is if it's harder it is to bring two concepts together when you slow down, the more likely it is that in your brain those concepts are not related to one another, right? They're coming from different parts of your brain. And so that's what we're going to talk about now, is what parts of the brain are those things coming from that make this hard. So if you think about it, the human brain, a big part of your human brain is what is reptilian or lizard brain. It is the part of your brain that allowed your ancestors to survive long enough for your parents to have you. Okay? I mean, it is the part that recognized danger. And by recognizing danger, your ancestors survived. But then there's this whole huge part of the human brain that's not about that. Guess which is the most powerful part of the human brain? Is it the cortex, that big gray part, or is it that little tiny reptilian part? It's the reptilian part. And it's the first part of your brain that reacts to all incoming stimuli, right? So it starts out there. So let's think about that. What that means is your brain is actually taking in, you've already taken in the time I've been talking, somewhere close to like 1 million different stimuli. Smells, sights, sounds. Your brain is doing what with all of them? I mean, if you had to stop and think about each piece of incoming information, what would happen to you? Your entire brain would be fried in like a minute. There's just too much. So your brain is just constantly filtering out based on rules it knows, saying, I don't need to worry about that, right? So the classic example would be if Dean McGill were to walk in, I would assign that like a 2. You know, it's not an actual threat. It's not life or death. It's a little nerve-wracking. But if a California grizzly comes in, I'm going to assign that a 10, and I've got to outrun all but one of you, right? I mean, that's what happens. The human brain reacts. And it's that part of our brain that is taking in all that sensory input all the time, deciding if we're threatened in any way. So for most of you right now, you don't feel threatened in any particular way sitting here, right? But if I started individually calling on you, what would happen? You'd feel threatened because you'd be worried, right? So that's one way to think about it. And we do this, our brains do this to survive because it's a core resource, is how much bandwidth you have. I mean, how many of you have always said, I'm out of bandwidth, I can't do any more projects, I can't do any more work? That's because your brain can only handle so much at any given time. So you organize all that incoming data with shortcuts that you're not aware of because they're part of that reptilian brain that evolved over many years that we still have. You know, one of the things I'm particularly curious about is how long will it take for that to shift now that most of us are knowledge workers and not fighting for daily survival, physical survival. And yet our brains are still optimized for a world where that was the truth. The other thing is we just don't pay attention to what's not right in front of us, right? We pay attention to the thing we have to focus on right now, and we let the rest of it fall by the wayside. So if I talk to you right now, you will pay attention to diversity and inclusion for some short span of time after this talk, but it's hard to sustain that over time unless you can create new habits. And we'll talk a little bit about that at the end. So that rapid cognition, that fact that our reptilian brain is making a lot of these decisions means that a lot of times those decisions are not consistent with our values, right? What we think we want to act upon doesn't somehow get translated to our limbic system saying, hey, work with me. I want to make sure that we're not acting in ways that are irrational or biased. But we don't have a way that we know of to tell that to the reptilian brain. But there's some interesting research coming about ways we might be able to turn it slow it down in its response. So just give you one example of perception. Some of you may remember this after Hurricane Katrina. So after Hurricane Katrina, you can see one news agency found a black person with some things talking about how this was looting. That was the word they used in their article as an example of looting. And a very similar picture of 2 white individuals, and they were finding groceries, right? And so just a huge difference. Did somebody consciously sit down and say, I'm going to caption these in 2 different ways to create this I don't know that anybody sat down and actually consciously thought about it. They were most likely acting on an implicit information that they had in their brain. And that unfortunate stereotype was black people loot, right? That may not be their conscious value, but that's what they put down on the piece of paper. So the explicit part, you're self-aware. I mean, if you're actually biased, you're aware of it, and often you can hide it from others, but sometimes you don't, right? There are people who are perfectly willing to put their prejudice and bias right out there. The problem with the implicit bias is often we don't even know about it. Right? It's not that we're consciously hiding it from other people. We actually don't even know that we're making those decisions in that 90% of our unconscious mind that we can't access. And so that reptilian brain, that unconscious part, is making a lot of emotional reaction to situations, as opposed to our cognitive brain, which has grown so large, right, relative to our bodies, it's huge, that actually can let us make responses that are consistent. So that's one thing I want you to kind of think about is there's the reactive part of our brain and there's the I want to respond part of our brain. And the problem is how do we get that respond part to take over instead of that reactive part? Yeah. Yeah. So I think the answer is they don't really know, right? I mean, this is one of those areas that's been identified as we should try to figure this out, but I don't think they think there's any way to find out how they got there other than it was protective, right? So anything that was not me or not like me is a danger, and therefore that's imprinted on the amygdala. Anything that is not like me is dangerous. So alligators are dangerous, and bears are dangerous, and people who don't look like me are dangerous because of the tribal origin. That would be the theory, is the kind of tribal origin, right? So difference is what, but the question is, does that make any sense today? Because our conscious minds, for most of us, that doesn't make any sense to think, oh, this person's dangerous, right? That doesn't compute. So how is it that that implicit bias overtakes me? So that's what I want to get to. But I think the answer is they don't really know how they first imprint there. I think this is one way to think about it. If it comes into the amygdala, which is the first place that all sensory information comes into, you get an emotional stimulus, and that amygdala pumps out an emotional response. And so the more interesting question to me is, how can we get it to go through the cortex to say, okay, that first emotional response wasn't accurate, and push it down into a different kind of response? So this, to me, is some of the most fascinating research about how implicit bias starts, which is how the human brain favors immediately the group you're in. And when I say the group you're in, I don't mean anything about how you look, right? So let's just think about that for a minute. Human brains increased in size as we started to gather with more and more people, right? So as human beings, first they were in really small groups, then the groups became larger, and as the groups became larger, the human brain continued to expand. Because you need all that gray matter to do what? To figure out other people, right? So there's a pretty strong evidence that as the brain enlarged, it was because we were interacting with more and more people, so I need to understand more, I need to be able to process more of your your nonverbal language right now, your body language about this. You're nodding, so like you're listening to me or you're hoping I won't call on you, kind of hard to tell with the nod. But that's what people are, right? The human brain evolved because we're going to be in these large social groups. We have an affinity bias, a preference for those who are similar to us. We have an in-group bias that we favor those who are perceived to be like us. And in competitive circumstances, we perceive negativity toward those who are not part of our group. This is the part that blew me away. It turns out that this is automatic. Like, I could kind of understand. Like, think about like a basic elementary school classroom. If you divide the girls and the boys, I'm sure you were at some point in your life in a situation like that, and you have an affinity for those who are like you, the girls, or the boys team, right? That makes sense to me, kind of on a gut check level. I could see how that could work. Why would that be if I just said to you, you're in group 1? If I just say, you're group 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, it turns out that instantly, if I start giving you tests to do, you will favor other people in group 1 if you're in group 1. Okay, well, maybe it just is happenstance. Maybe group 1, they look at each other like, okay, similar, I can deal with that. It turns out even if you don't know who else is in your group, you know nothing about them. Maybe they don't even exist. I just tell you, you're group 1 and you're group 2. And I start giving you assignments, you will favor others that you think are assigned to group 1, even though you've never seen their face. Which I think is really interesting, because that tells you that this in-group bias actually doesn't have anything to do with how we look. It's about a perception. Well, the problem with that is, how do you get into the in-group of the powerful people who are making decisions about your career? Right? Because if you're in the in-group, you're perceived as like me and I favor you. But how do you break over that barrier? I think that's one of the greatest hurdles that most of us face once we're out into the professional world. You can enhance this by having common shared goals. So teams that have a strong goal orientation and that are working toward a common goal will tend to have even a stronger in-group bias. Once you introduce competition, that's when people start to feel negative. Usually they feel neutral about the out-group until there's competition. Once you introduce competition, then you start to feel negatively toward that out-group. And think about that in the context of, business or firm life. Is there competition? Well, sure there is, for resources, for advancement, and so you start to get that. The famous example of this comes all the way from 1954. They took a bunch of kids to a camp. It was Robbers Cave State Park. And what they did was they had the boys spend a couple days doing kind of team building exercises, and they measured how many of they were the eagles and the snakes. You know, how many eagles had friends over in the snake group and how many snakes had friends over in the eagle group. And then they put them in competition. And once they put the two teams in competition, what happened to the friendships? They completely fell. All of your loyalty was either to your eagles or your snakes. Then they decided, well, can we bring them back together? And they weren't having much success. So what they did is they created a fake emergency, that the water tower, you know, they couldn't open the faucet to the water tower, and the kids had to work together to solve it. And what happened to the friendships across the groups? They reemerged, right? So interesting research to think about if you're a team leader in any way, is getting focused on that shared goal is the best way to kind of integrate that team. So the implicit association test takes what we did with that Stroop test and says, can I measure your implicit bias? So it was the first real attempt to say, not just we think it's there, but could you measure it? And so how many of you have actually taken one of them? Yeah, so I think it's a great exercise. You can go to Harvard, you just type in implicit by association test, you can find it easily. It has different tests, so you can take it based on gender, religion, thin, fat, male, female, black, white. They have like 16 of them now across any number of dimensions. And what they do is they ask you, for example, with the black-white test, they will put up faces, black faces and white faces, and a series of words. They'll have you do it right-handed and left-handed to take out brain dominance. And they measure the time lag to associate positive words with black faces. And they say the longer that time lag, the more likely that those two ideas are in different, you know, parts of your cortex. It's harder for you to associate them. And that's just a measure. It's a proxy for whether you have implicit bias. It's not a proxy for are you prejudiced or are you discriminating. It's about how hard it is for you to bring those two ideas together at the same time. It'll tell you if it's small, medium, a lot. Can you cheat this test? Absolutely. How could you cheat this test? Just go really slowly, right? If you go infinitely slowly, you can make sure that it says you have no implicit bias. Of course, it's not interesting. Taken by millions of people. Strong evidence. Two of the effects that I think are the most profound, when women take the test, women and male, associating positive words with female faces versus male, do they show more prejudice or more implicit bias than men against women? Yeah. In the black-white test, it turns out black people often have a harder time associating positive words with black faces. So it reinforces a lot of the research that says we kind of have a chameleon effect. We take on the labels. If I always say to you, this is who you are, over time you start to integrate that, which I think is, you know, tremendously damaging. But there's pretty strong evidence to support that. Now, the book, if anybody wants to look at it, is Blind Spot. That's the name that they have for this research. It's been the go-to research for more than a decade. And what's interesting in my mind about it has been there is evidence to support that the stronger the implicit bias, the more likely you are to act in prejudiced ways, but it's not overwhelming. It's not super strong that it impacts. So, for example, they did one study of law students. And they had them take the male-female test, and it turned out that kind of like the general population, the implicit bias measure was about the same. But when they gave those same law students, now here's the school budget, figure out how much different student groups should get, they didn't give kind of overtly or suggestive female student groups less money, right? So even though there was an implicit measure, it didn't seem to come out in their decision making. And we'll talk about why that might be. There's only one test in all the years that this test has existed where the amount of bias has shifted, and that's in the sexual preference. So are you gay or straight? So they have a gay versus straight test. I don't think they've gone any further than that into gender identity and some of those kinds of issues. But that test has actually shown a 13% decrease in implicit bias measures over a very short period of time. It's the only test to ever do that. And so that's one area that they're really researching is, well, what about that? compared to the fight for civil rights, compared to the fight for women's rights, what made that different that you saw the needle move in a statistically significant way? So I think that's kind of an interesting issue. Just to give you an idea of how people don't pay attention to things that aren't right in front of them, I always love this one. Maybe it's just that those of us who are lay people don't always spot implicit bias. Maybe other people would. I always thought this was interesting. They took a bunch of radiologists, and they said, here's a bunch of breast x-rays. This is what they do all day long, right, is they read breast x-rays for bumps. And you might be able to see, you can't because the lights are on. Look up in that upper right corner. Can you see anything right there? So they planted a picture of a gorilla in the images. How many of their eyes crossed the gorilla? Most of them. How many of them noticed the gorilla? Almost none of them, because it's not what they're looking for. What were they looking for? Breast lumps, right? So it's an interesting thing. We don't look for it if we're not paying attention. Lots of really interesting research that even a half-hour training on implicit bias actually will have a sustained effect in reducing implicit bias. If we give you tests again, like if we tested you, did a half-hour lecture, tested you again in 12 weeks, you'll show lower scores on implicit bias. So even very tiny interventions do seem to have some kind of impact. There is a pending paper. It actually, a little typo there. There is a pending paper that's going to say they don't think it's very strongly correlated, that implicit bias really isn't that strongly correlated to behavior. But that will be a pretty radical departure from all of the previous peer-reviewed studies. So I don't have access yet. It's out for peer review to know what will happen with that. So if you add cognitive bias, people have lots of other biases, not just their implicit biases, but just the overt things that we tend to underestimate. And one is confirmation bias. Once we're doing something, we'll only look for evidence that confirms our belief. So that happens a lot. You get hired into the workplace, but I look at you and I see somebody and I associate all the stereotypes that my brain has, not consciously, but then it confirms my initial impression. I look for evidence to confirm that. One of the ones I think is the most interesting, because it turns out not to be cross-cultural, is fundamental attribution error. In the United States, we tend to put things on the person, not the situation. So if you're not doing well, it's because of you, not because of your situation, your age, your gender, your race. But in other cultures that are more collectivist, they don't make this error as much. They are more likely to look at the situation and say, okay, the situation is causing this challenge. So it's one thing I think for Americans to be particularly sensitive to is we tend to attribute people's success and failures to them as an individual and not look at the circumstantial around them that might account for that. That might be why it's been so difficult to address systemic discrimination in law firms, right? At least in American law firms, and you may see a different profile. Blink is a book that talks about this. Blink is a book that says, you know what? Most of the time, that snap judgment your amygdala makes is right, right? So don't worry about it. Now, the problem with that is this. Are sometimes your snap judgments wrong? So what do you do about that, right? Sometimes you just don't get it right. Your amygdala fires off, this person's dangerous. She's not really dangerous to me. Why'd my amygdala say that, right? So you have to think about that. And one of the things that he found was you could prime people to think about others in a different way. So it turns out this is one great way if you're worried about implicit bias. And it's basically tricking the brain. In this particular one, what they did was they gave people articles that were almost identical, but in one, there were words that are associated with being polite, and one had words that were associated with being rude. And then there was just a neutral group where it didn't have either one. And when people read that, which group of people interrupted more immediately following the test? People who'd read the article that had words about being rude, right? So they were primed in their behavior. Do you think they were consciously aware that people had done that to them? Probably not. They did one on teaching. What if I ask you to rate a teacher? In this case, a teacher's assistant. When they weren't told anything about the TA, they gave ratings of 9.3. When some of the students were told negative things about the TA, I tell you, oh, she's really terrible. Don't rely too much on this because it won't be on the test. And then I said, oh, but don't let that influence you. Your scores drop to an 809. But if I just tell you bad things about the TA, it dropped to a 6.58. So think about that I think about that from a teaching perspective all the time. If students tell you I'm a great teacher, you take my class and you rate me high, and if they say I'm a crummy teacher, you listen to it, right? This is how most young people make so many of their decisions, even though it can be completely manipulated. This is what I think is the better model, thinking fast and slow. So if I wanted you to not use your reptilian brain to make the decision, I would have to get you to engage system 2. And thinking fast and slow says that's exactly it. There's this first system that makes that snap judgment, that amygdala that's sorting that information so fast and saying danger, not danger, okay? System 2 is all that extra gray matter that we've brought on board through evolution. What does it say? Can you step back and activate that? And the way that's important is if you wanted to overtake your implicit bias, you'd actually have to stop and say, well, does that make sense to me that I'm thinking in that way about this person or this situation? So I'll give you an example. Don't freak out. It's not hard math. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? What's the answer? 10 cents. How many people say 10 cents? How many people think it's not 10 cents? Because if it was that obvious, then I wouldn't put it up there, right? Yeah, he knew there was a trick question there. So system 1, right, said 10 cents. That was your split-second snap judgment thought about it, right? The question is, do you move on to system 2 and say, does that make sense? And so the actual answer is 5 cents. If you set this up as an algebra problem, we could do it on the board afterward if any of you really want to go back to the 8th grade with me, but we could set it up as an algebra problem. But what happens is some people never go back and revisit that, right? And that's because I didn't give you any time to do so. But if you had time, would you have been satisfied with your 10-cent answer, or would you actually have taken out a piece of scrap paper if you needed to start figuring out? The answer is really 5 cents. And what I think is interesting about that is when they looked at MIT, Princeton, and Harvard, 50% of students gave that 10-cent answer, that wrong answer, and stuck with it. They did nothing, right? So not a timed environment. It's one of many problems. They answered it 10 cents. They moved on. When you go to less selective universities, 88% of the students put down 10% and then did nothing to kind of double check to see, does that make sense? So the conclusion is that a lot of us have a lazy system too, right? We're so used to relying on that amygdala, making those split-second decisions, and they're right so often that we kind of eventually quit thinking, well, does that really make sense to me? Is that really the right answer? And I think that's a lot of what happens in implicit bias, is we have that first system makes a snap judgment, and we don't challenge it cognitively. We don't activate the rest of the cortex. So implicit bias in law, lots been written. Most of it has been focused on implicit bias in judicial decision-making and policing. Right, so overwhelmingly, the focus initially has been on criminal law. More recently, there are starting to be some articles that focus specifically on gender and implicit bias in the law. And I want to talk about a couple. The one where there's kind of the most active research right now are ones where there's some ability to measure. So I'm sure Susan could elaborate on some of these, but hiring and do you get an interview or call back, hiring, and then actual performance reviews. So this was a study that was done, just published in December, where what they did was they made fake resumes. It's one of the #1 ways they do research about hiring decisions. So they made fake resumes. They used different things, so either a male or female, associated name. They picked a last name. It was either Clark, which was considered kind of lower status, and Cabot, so higher status. They had one had gone to the university and one had gone on a scholarship for athletes. And they had different sports. One was like sailing and the other one was track and field. So they tried to make them so that there were distinctions both in gender and then whether they were considered higher or lower class, kind of what socioeconomic judgments might be made about them by the people looking at the resumes. So they sent them to 316 offices of 147 firms. okay? And here's what happened. Higher class men, 16% chance they'd get a job interview. Higher class women, so the only difference in these resumes is whether it was a male or female name. 3%. When they turn to the lower class, 1 in 78 men. The difference being the last name, whether you'd been on scholarship, and what sport you played. That's the difference, down to from 16% to 1%. Anybody else shocked by that? I mean, I have a weird feeling. I wasn't shocked. I'm just appalled. Because I keep thinking it's 2017. You know, how did that happen? And it's kind of interesting. So what they did is they're like, well, the problem with this is we don't know why. Right? People called us up and said, I want to interview this candidate. And that's how they get these statistics. But what we don't have is a mechanism to say, well, why did you choose that person? Why did you call them back? Why didn't you call back the other person? So what they did was they took then 200 practicing lawyers and sent out the resumes to a different group of 200 lawyers. Their data was consistent, but now they interviewed them and said, well, why did you pick that person? And here's what they found out about it. Even though higher class women were seen as good fits, so it turned out fit was the #1 answer when people said why they chose the higher class versus lower class was good fit at the firm, right? Even though the higher class women were seen as just as good fits as the men, the explanation given was we're not going to call them back for an interview because we don't think those high class women are likely to work at a demanding job and stay. I got 68 rejection letters the first time I applied for a legal job. The assumption being you don't have to work, right? You're high class, high status. You're not likely to work in the profession or stay in the profession. That is probably one of the #1 biases that continues to affect women in law, is that assumption. And the second is the maternity bias, that once you have children, that you will somehow leave the law. And often those are completely unspoken, right? Nobody's overtly saying we don't want women, right? If the women say I want to work and the men say we want women to work, then we ought to be seeing parity, shouldn't we? So it has to be something else that's going on. A big chunk of it's structural. That's just my personal belief. I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone else. I think it's structural. I think there are a lot of people battering away at that wall right now. But I think this implicit part is a lot more dangerous about that assumption, because that assumption underlying people's, that's affecting what assignments you get, right? Not just getting your foot in the door, but even if you get there, this continues to exist. Performance reviews are another area. Performance reviews are often worded in non-gender neutral ways. A lot of large companies actually hire outside consultants to come through and read through reviews to see if they're not gender biased. I'm personally not aware of any firm that's doing that. But one firm just announced that they're switching out of the traditional performance-based review. It's a little unclear exactly what they're doing, but I think what they're doing is kind of crowdsourcing so that you get more feedback year-round. You're not waiting till the end. And that's actually one of the strategies that a lot of consultants recommend, is if you can have crowdsourcing. So it's not just what do you think of Lucy's performance, but asking a lot of people so that you get a more, bigger cross-section of people. Might be one way to fight implicit bias. There are a lot of other examples that come up. I just picked a couple. One is a double-bind paradox. Are you competent or liked? So a lot of times, it's one or the other. You're perceived as being really competent, but you're aloof, too competitive. In one of my young reviews, I was told I was too intense. I still remember that. 20 years later, I'm still trying to figure out why that's a bad thing for a litigator, because it was not presented as a positive to me that I was intense. Or do you want to be liked by people, right? Is it that you want, and this is a tough one because many women are socialized for what? Want to be liked, want to make connection, want to collaborate, right? One of the difficulties with that is that very collaboration can also get us in trouble. I want to talk about that more in a minute. The promotion paradox. Are you bragging or are you letting people know your accomplishments? And then are you actually networking to your advantage in business? I'll talk about each of those three. So a lot of the research says both men and women agree women are better collaborators than men, right? Which has a lot to do with actually the female brain. The piece of the brain that lets the two hemispheres connect and communicate is actually larger in women than in men, right? Which actually says we are able to switch back and forth faster between kind of rational thinking and the social interaction. But when we are collaborating, so I'm talking to you and what do you think about this idea? Can your department do that on time or will you need more time? So we're doing what we think are techniques that are collaborating, trying to get your buy-in, actually get perceived as asking for permission, right? That I'm asking for permission to do that, that I'm indecisive, I'm not sure whether that's the right answer, and that's why I'm asking you, well, what do you think, instead of saying this is what we're gonna do. And we dilute our authority. So, that's why I call it a paradox. It's like, how do you weigh those two things between am I collaborating or am I, so I'm liked and I think I'm team building versus I'm undermining my credibility and competence. The next one is that women don't ask. So I told you, right? The in-group, you have a bias toward the in-group, and you don't really have any feelings about the out-group. You're neutral until they're in competition with you. And most things in life are about finite resources. It's a competition. So this is the first book that I ask all young women that I'm mentoring to read. It's a professor who had a graduate student came to her and said, I didn't get the prime teaching assignment. None of the male professors gave me the prime assignment. Well, my professor assumes that there's what? Discrimination going on, right? So she goes to her colleagues, well, why didn't you? Why didn't you ask her? She didn't ask me that she wanted to teach the class. Why didn't you hire? She didn't ask me. So then she did a study, and she looked at people graduating from business school, I think it was, and when she, adjusted for the cities and all that kind of stuff, she found that on average, the men were making more money. Well, that's a sign of discrimination, right? So then she tried to find out, well, what were your offer letters? The offer letters to men and women were the same. A much higher percentage of the men called up and said, I'm going to need more money to accept the offer. So the men perceived that it was a negotiation, and the women perceived that I have to either accept or reject the offer. There's a lot of follow-up research to this, that women tend not to ask for the opportunities that they want. There's research that says, for example, with job descriptions, that a lot of times men will apply even though they don't meet all the requirements, but women rarely apply if they don't meet all the job requirements. So I can't tell you how many times I've had a young woman be like, well, they say they want 7 years of experience. I'm like, you got 6, go. Like, don't let that stand in your way. So I think that's a real issue, is do women, I think there are a lot of cultural and societal reasons that we've been told don't do that. Do we actually ask for the opportunities and resources? Do we actually raise our hand? One of the things I can tell you is for those women in the room who are about my age, so if you're one of the Gen Xers have a strong conviction that the world is a meritocracy and that merit and competence should prevail. How many of you have ever worked on a team where the most competent person was not the team leader, right? But we hold that belief really strongly. And it turns out Gen X really struggles with that at work. That's the single biggest dissonance for them, is how incompetent people can be the leaders, because we feel so strongly in the meritocracy. Turns out women tend to be the same way. We think it should be a meritocracy, and you should know. Susan, you should know that she did outstanding work 6 months ago. Is that really true? How many of you remember what you wore 7 days ago? Unless you go on an archaeological dig through your closet, right? Why would you assume in a 6-month or annual review cycle that Susan remembers what it is you did 6 months ago and the great work you did? But it turns out that women and Gen Xers tend to hold that belief, that somehow people mythically know that they're the ones who've performed such that you should get to take that deposition, or you're ready to second chair this trial, as opposed to men raising their hand and saying, I want that, right? So I think that's something just for us to be thoughtful about, is am I doing that? I'm not asking for what I need. By the way, it turns out women are terrible at negotiating for themselves. A lot of research about this too. Lucy wants to take a stretch assignment, right? And she's like, oh, I'm not sure I'm qualified, and she finally kind of asks for it. She doesn't necessarily get the response she wants. In general, they're just generalities, women will often not do more. But if I take everything about Lucy and I say, you know what, I want you to negotiate this promotion on behalf of Susan, and I describe Susan and I give Susan all the same qualities and experience that Lucy has, she'll perform just as well as the men. She will negotiate almost $7,000 more for Susan than she will for herself. So it's actually one of the tricks that I recommend to a lot of women is perspective taking, which is think about yourself as a third person. It sounds weird. Don't start talking about yourself in the third person, because that's definitely weird, and only certain politicians do that. But instead, think about, well, if there was another woman, one of my peers looks exactly like me, what would I think would be the right and fair answer? And negotiate as though you were doing it for her. And it turns out we do a lot better. Again, we undervalue our own contribution, but we're somehow objective when we look at others. It's kind of a strange paradox. By the way, we underestimate totally how likely people are to say yes. Research over at the Stanford Business School says people are twice as likely to say yes when we ask them for things than we predict. This study always slays me. That people predicted you'd have to ask 10 strangers before one would let you borrow their cell phone, and it turns out you only have to ask 6.2 people and somebody will loan you their phone. I actually find that shocking, personally, because I'd be like, give me your wallet and I'll loan you my phone, right? But if you ask people on the street, will you deface a library book, which I can't even wrap my mind around, people predicted you'd have to ask 11 and a half people, but it turns out people are more willing to deface a library book for you than loan you their cell phone. But really, if you stop and think about that, people are 50% more likely to say yes than you're predicting. Why don't you ask for the opportunity that you want on that next assignment, or I'd like the chance to meet with the client, or I want to sit in and lead that meeting, right? They're twice as likely to say yes, and then once they say yes, what do? Let's say I say yes to you, but you're a little young and inexperienced. It's maybe not going quite as well as I'd hoped. And my colleague Susan says, well, I don't really think she's doing as well as could be. What do I say back to Susan? Are you nuts? She is a rock star. Why do I do that? Because I'm going to double down to confirm that my first judgment was the right judgment, which is she was ready for the opportunity. So once somebody said, they're 50% more likely to say yes than we predict, and once they say yes, they will look for reasons why they were smart to say yes, right? So it's about breaking, if you can break that first one, then you get a huge boost in what follows. One of the other paradoxes that happens for women is direct versus indirect communication. This also is hugely cross-cultural. So a lot of women are socialized for less direct communication, right? So we engage, they see this as young as about 2.5. Girls tend to play face-to-face, boys tend to play side-by-side, right? So there's probably some hard wiring issues between men and women, but we are taught to socialize by trying to be indirect, right? So what are kinds of indirect things? I don't say, this memo did not meet my expectations. What do I say instead? I think you really need to try to do another revision of this, right? What does she actually hear? That was good. I just need to revise it one more time, right? There's this big disconnect because often we are very indirect, right? It's kind of that same thing about competence. Instead of telling you, this is what I've decided the team is going to do, I say, what do you think of this strategy? Because I think I'm collaborating instead of being direct with you and telling. It's a continuum. This does not say that all women are on one end or the other. The reality is there's a lot of runway, and sometimes I'm much more direct, and sometimes I'm much more indirect. But you can choose. But a lot of times people don't make a conscious choice about it. This is also hugely cross-cultural, right? There are other cultures where being indirect is the appropriate communication style. And when the American lawyer joins the deal team, they're like, who are you coming in here and telling us this is what we're going to do with a bunch of bullet points? Like, that's not how we do it. And so that's an area where a lot of US attorneys have huge blind spots when they join international teams. Meetings. A lot of implicit bias happens in meetings. So this was a slide that just showed what men said about meetings and what women said. Men were afraid how women will react to criticism. The women, I don't get the feedback I need. Women need to be concise and remain on point. Women, I don't need to restate the obvious. This is actually one of my biggest ones. Like, why do people keep repeating the good idea? It doesn't get better, right? And yet, again, there's, I think, a huge gender component. So this is just one way to kind of think about that. A lot of times, we are penalized. So they've actually done research. When women enter a room, so if there's a room with a conference table and then there are chairs around the walls, what mistake do a lot of women make? Where do they sit down? Against the wall. Is that where they should be sitting? Where should they be sitting? At the table. It's not even leaning in. You actually have to get to the table before you can lean in, right? So even some of those initial choices, women will tend to come right when the meeting starts. When do you think the most important parts of the meeting are? The 5 minutes before and the 10 minutes after, right? Because that's actually when a lot of the decision making and interactions where we get to know each other are actually happening, right? So one of the things we often do is we use qualified language. So one of the things, how many women, you can kind of think about this, do you hear say things like, I don't think I have my slide in here about this, but I'm not an expert, but. How many of you have ever heard a man say that in a meeting? It's a huge difference. And again, it has to do with we're trying to reduce our threat level, that I'm powerful and I'm competent. I want to be collaborative. So I say, I think we should, to soften it. But what's the actual start of the sentence? I think we should bring this motion for summary judgment. Is I really the subject? What's the subject? We should bring the motion for summary judgment. And so actually for a while, I actually had that on a notepad. I had the word I with an X through it. And you just try not to use the word I. I tried to quit actually starting sentences with I feel, I think, I believe, right? We use that hedging language that gives away our competence. And then we don't sit at the table to actually participate. One of the most powerful things that women don't do is tell people what their accomplishments are. Because a lot of us were socialized that you shouldn't do what? You shouldn't brag. So I want to say there's a lot of runway between owning what you did and bragging, right? I am not at all saying stand up on a conference room table and say, hey, I'm the best lawyer in the firm. No other lawyer is better than I am. That's bragging, okay? But you absolutely should tell people about your accomplishments. So I'll give you one example. Catalyst does a lot of research in this area. And what they did was they looked at high potential men and women and the strategies both that companies used to advance and promote them, but then they also looked at, well, what are the strategies that the people choose to advance their careers? And to give you some idea, one way to advance your career is to get high profile assignments, right? Like go to work for a firm's largest clients would be an example. Try to network with important leaders at the firm. Make your accomplishments better known, right? Those are just strategies you could choose. Okay? Out of curiosity, and it's not up there, what do you think is the number one thing that most organizations do to help advance women? Anybody have a guess? Yeah. Mentor, that is it. That is the number one thing they do. Is there a single study that says having a mentor improves your likelihood of advancement? You've got a good guess here. 50%. Yeah, none. There are none that I am aware of that say that having a mentor helps advance your career. So think about that. That's what firms, other organizations are spending a ton of money on. There's actually not very much evidence at all that a mentor will help to advance you in your career. What do you think is the number one strategy that the women chose in this study to get ahead? They wanted to. They were already identified as high potential. High potential that you're going to be outstanding in the firm. I mean, this is a generic. It's not two firms, but you're a high potential. You can pick a strategy. Any idea what the number one strategy was that women picked? Work hard. That was the number one strategy the women picked. Now, what's the problem with that strategy? Well, you're already doing it, so you're really talking about work harder. How did you get to be identified as a high potential? By working hard. So continuing to do that's really not going to move the needle at all. It was the price of admission to get identified as being somebody who was high potential. What do you think was the best strategy? The one strategy that actually seemed to move the needle was also the strategy women picked the least. It's that promotion paradox. Tell people your accomplishments. Don't hide them. So I'll give you the example, because this is what I try to pick kind of one thing each quarter sort of to work on personally. And this has now been mine for actually more like 5 months, because I'm only sort of successful at it now. When somebody comes up to me and says, "Thank you, that was a really interesting talk," what should be the next words out of my mouth? Thank you. And that's what my mother taught me. But instead, what is it that I say? I don't usually say that. Okay, I'm not willing to go that self-deprecating. But what do I say instead? It was nothing. Was it nothing? I put together a presentation last fall. I probably read 40 to 50 books and papers on the subject. I probably spent, 80 hours putting together the slide deck and, interviewing people. And then when people said that was great, I was like, oh, it was nothing. What? And it wasn't until I was thinking about this, I'm like, I'm doing exactly what I say not to do. Because what could I say instead? Thank you. Or when somebody says, Michelle, that was a great outcome on that summary judgment motion. What do a lot of women do? I had a great team. What's the right answer to that? Or a more effective answer? Thanks. I really loved working with you on that, and I appreciate the opportunity to work on such an interesting matter. And I really helped that I had a great team behind me. Because I'm owning, who led that team? Why do I immediately give all the credit to somebody else? So really thinking about some of our own actions and what can be happening there, I think, is really important. So let's talk about, if you think you have implicit bias, the number one strategies that seem to work are just knowledge about that. So a lot of research that says that as much as a half hour can seem to have some effect. They've done somewhat longer studies on both race and gender. So for example, they did one with university professors where they gave a 2.5 hours, so I'm assuming that was like a half-day workshop on implicit bias and gender. That was enough to substantially lower people's implicit bias scores over time going forward. So just knowledge turns out to activate that cortex, right? To be aware. It kind of tells that lazy second system, hey, pay attention to some of the things that I'm doing. The other one is mindfulness. There's a lot of, now, if you'd asked me 5 years ago what I thought about mindfulness, I'd have been like, no. I've done a lot of research. I think it's overwhelming about what it does to the brain. We know it actually physically alters the brain. People who practice meditation regularly, it does alter the connectivity in the brain. It increases actual communication between different parts of the brain. But what they think is mindfulness, what mindfulness is being aware in the moment without judgment. So if you spend 10 minutes a day practicing that without judgment, what do you think starts to happen? What they think starts to happen is you're basically strengthening that part of your cognitive muscle without judgment so that it starts to reduce your implicit bias. So a lot of evidence that the more you practice mindfulness, the lower your implicit bias scores become. And the thought is it's because you're exercising and developing that without judgment piece. Priming would be the other thing. Just like we talked about those articles about people being rude or polite, well, before you go in, prime yourself. Think about, well, who do I know who's an outstanding, female attorney? Or who do I know who's an outstanding minority associate? And really, that primes you then to be looking for the positive, right? And challenging those stereotypes. Those would be some. Let's talk about the bystander problem. How many of you have ever seen what you thought was either overt or implicit bias and said nothing? Yeah, because it's hard. Why do we say nothing? What's the number one reason we say nothing? It's fear, right? It's fear of something, usually of either people's reactions, the detrimental outcome that we're afraid of, or the consequences, right, in some way. That's what we're worried about. I thought this was a great example of how little it takes and how powerful it can be was this report that came from a number of sources within President Obama's administration. In his first term as president, only about half of his kind of people reporting to him on a regular basis were women. It wasn't even half. I can't remember now. 2/3 it was about a third. Third women, 2/3 men. But what the women were upset about was that when they were in meetings, nobody ever asked their opinions, right? They were just kind of, either had the speak over or, My personal favorite, there are words for these things, like mansplaining, when men explain what women said, or bropriating, when they repeat what you said that was a great idea and take credit for it. Like, I didn't know there was a whole vocabulary around that. That's kind of fun. What they decided to do was band together. They didn't go confront President Obama and say, we think you're acting in this way that's biased or discriminatory. What they did was they decided to call their strategy amplification, so that if Lucy said something, then I would make sure to chime in and say, I think that's good, to amplify what she had to say. And it turned out by the time they were into the second administration, President Obama had increased the number of women that were in his kind of inner circle, and they did report that they felt they were being listened to and more included in decision making, right? So not even a confrontational strategy. It's about somebody having first the courage to kind of speak up, but then other women supporting them in a pretty subtle way that changed the dynamic that was going on in that room. I liked one analogy that said it's like CPR. You have to think about when you think you're seeing bias or discrimination, is it a one-time incident? Is it a pattern of incidents? Or is this actually like a relationship issue that is so negatively impacting me that I have to take some immediate action? And I think that's important, because not doing anything costs you energy, costs you stomach lining, costs you kind of psychic pain. So one is to speak up. By the way, I should tell you, I found almost nothing in the literature about what to do when you think there's implicit bias. Almost all of the research is focused on how do you reduce your personal implicit bias, or how do you as an organization try to change. But almost nothing about what do we do when I think you say something. The off-colored joke, not giving the assignment to the person, saying, well, I know you're a new mom, you don't want to travel, so I'm going to have so-and-so argue the motion. What is it that we can do? Almost nothing. To the extent I found things, one was kind of just to speak up, making sure you stay calm. Oh, that's really easy to do when you think you're being discriminated and disrespected, right? I mean, like, how many of you, when you're in a fight and somebody says to you, calm down, what does that do? Right? That's like throwing gasoline on your fire, right? At least that is for me. So I think one of the things to focus on is I want to respond and not react, meaning I don't have to do it in the moment it's happening. Real clarity about the change that you want made. And I think a lot of times this is where we fall down. When we want change, we just go in and complain. But what we don't say is, this is what I want. What's the ask? I want to argue the next motion. I want to lead the next deal team. So being very concrete. Do you want an apology? Do you want the next opportunity? What is it that you're looking for? And then really focusing on something that I learned from Susan, which was research out of our business school, called Stay on Your Side of the Net, which is, I know the impact that your joke had on me. It made me uncomfortable. My son's part of the LGBT community. What you said I felt was very disrespectful and insensitive. I can just blow up at you and confront you and say, you're a creep. Don't do that. You intended to hurt me. You intended to be disrespectful. How many times do we say that? Do we really know what her intentions were? No. And a lot of times they weren't actually bad. But we confuse the impact and the intent. And so one of those things about be calm is to wait till you have clarity about what you want. What is it I want from you? An apology for you not to tell jokes like that anymore. What is it I'm asking for? And then to separate out. Don't attack her intentions, but to give her the I message about how it made me feel, or the negative effect it's having on the office, or the negative effect it's having on clients. Because a lot of people are unaware of the impact of what they did. So really making that separation, I think, is really important. If you want books on these, this one actually was recommended by some Stanford Law students to me, Difficult Conversations. I also like this one called Crucial Conversations, but they're both focused on how do you have conversations when you are really emotionally charged up by what the person has said or done. And so I think they're both kind of worth reading to prepare you for those kinds of conversations and how do I step back and do that. Other questions for me? Yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. So what they call that the maternity bias. I think that's very prevalent. What I didn't include, there's just a bunch of research that came out about the disproportionate number of women who are in certain practice areas that are also perceived as, pink ghettos, so to speak, of, this is where we send women who, because it's not as demanding, it doesn't require as many hours, whatever narrative they want to have around that. I think one of the things is being aware of it. How many of you have ever had, I can think back to a very specific example and see, since I'm being videotaped, I'm not going to say what it is because I probably will get angry. Said something to me very explicit when I had my first child, and I just didn't have a comeback. And then you think about the comeback later, and you're like, oh, I wish I'd said that. But I think a lot of that is having clarity around that and just coming out and saying. So, for example, I came back, I had my first child when I was up for partner, and I went in and said, look, this is what I've done, and I should partner with my class for these reasons, and if my maternity leave is used as an excuse for not making me a partner, I will be extremely disappointed. And I was very pointed about it. Not threatening, just I'm going to be really disappointed, and I let them fill in the blank. I think a lot of times we don't say, right? Or, yeah, there's nobody who's ever done that who has kids, but coming back and saying, I'm returning to work full time, and this is the position I want. But a lot of times we just assume that we'll be asked, and then when we're not asked, I also found a lot of times I attributed things to either being a woman or having kids as opposed to being young, and that people who had age and guile were outsmarting me in certain areas. So I think it's also, you got to be a little bit careful about what's really the assumption that you're making, because sometimes we're just off. But yeah, I think it's very real. There's a lot of empirical evidence to support that. Yeah. 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 So I think that's a really interesting, so one is, do they bring different perspectives to the problem, right? So law is different. If you think about how corporations work, when a corporation needs to assemble a team, they say, I need the person who's really smart technically. I need the person who's a great marketing person. I need the person who understands, how to work with the customers and find out what they want. And they assemble that team based on their unique competencies. Law is the only profession in firms where we expect every person to be good at everything, right? So it's not like we set up a law team and say, okay, I want the person who's really good at reading clients and binding them to the firm, and I want the person who's really good researcher, and we don't do it that way. So I think it's a lot harder to figure out in a law firm environment what we mean by that, what's inclusive. I think one is soliciting everybody's opinion. I think that's counterintuitive for a lot of people, especially boomers who tend to be, here's my decision, and Gen Xers who are kind of like, let me know what my piece is and let me get out of here because I don't like collaborating, I like to be self-sufficient, to more of a model of, you've spent a lot of time with the client, what's the perspective? You've spent a lot of time working on this kind of case, what's the perspective? I think firms that cross-staff across offices tend to be better at it because they've exercised that muscle a little bit more. But it's very hard to tell exactly what that would look like in a law firm environment because it's just not like a regular corporation.
One thing that, and I'm thinking about it from perspective, let's say we put a junior staff member on the team very deliberately or on a committee, then the example of recognizing the importance of that diversity is making sure that you're asking that individual, you as a junior associate, what's your perspective, what's your take?
Yeah.
Not just putting the person on the team and then thinking you've done your job, but it's that inclusiveness.
Yeah.
Making sure that everybody gets a voice, because otherwise you haven't really accomplished.
Yeah, and that's a very common, right? It goes back to, it looks different, so that's fine. So there's interesting research for the corporate world that if they use kind of boards and C-suites to say, we'll use women and foreign nationals as a proxy for diversity, then it's definitely true that the more diverse the board is and the more diverse the C-suite is, the better their economic performance. There's studies that show that. In law firms, they used the Am Law 200 as a proxy. And they said, we'll look at kind of the partnership and executive committees of the firm to see how many women and minority attorneys are there, and we'll use that as a proxy. Are the Am Law 200's most profitable firms the most diverse? And the answer is yes. But which way does the causation run? Is it that they're more diverse and therefore they make more money? Or is it that they make more money so they have more money to spend on diversity efforts, right? And that's one of those horrible things, because a lot of people are like, well, it's causation. And I'm like, it's correlated. There's no evidence of which way that causation is running yet. And that's why a lot of firms, I think, struggle with this, because they can't quantify the rate of return from their diversity efforts. Okay. I'll hang around if there are questions, or if you want to take a quick look at the book. And if you think of questions later, it's not hard to find me. You just type in my name and you'll find it. All right, thanks.